She is one of the most decorated actresses Britain has ever produced, a double Oscar winner, a dame of the British Empire, a woman whose face has carried the weight of grief, wit, and quiet rebellion across 4 decades of film. But ask people who know Emma Thompson well what they consider her greatest achievement, and many of them won't mention a single trophy. They'll talk about a Christmas party at a refugee charity in London, and a 16-year-old boy from Rwanda who walked in not knowing a single person in the room. That boy had survived a genocide, the death of his father, the disappearance of his mother and sisters, and months spent sleeping rough near Trafalgar Square. Within a few years, he was calling Emma Thompson Mum. This is the story of how an Oscar-winning actress and a teenage refugee became a family, and how the experience changed both of their lives in ways neither could have predicted. Emma Thompson was born in Hammersmith, London, in April 1959, into a household where performance was simply the family business. Her father, Eric Thompson, was a much-loved actor and the voice behind a beloved children's television program, while her mother, the actress Phillida Law, filled the home with a different kind of theatrical energy. Emma and her younger sister Sophie grew up surrounded by scripts, rehearsals, and the rhythms of people who made their living pretending to be other people. It was, by all accounts, a warm and unusually creative upbringing, one that planted in Emma an early fascination with language and character that never really left her. She carried that fascination to Cambridge, where she read English at Newnham College and fell in with a group of young performers who would go on to define British comedy for a generation. Among them were Stephen Fry, Hugh Laurie, and a circle of similarly sharp, similarly ambitious students who spent more time devising sketches than attending lectures. Emma thrived in that environment. She had a gift for timing and for finding the joke buried inside something painful, and it didn't take long for her talent to be noticed. She eventually took on a leadership role within the university's celebrated comedy troupe and helped guide the group to a major win at one of Britain's most prestigious comedy festivals. It was also during her university years that she experienced a loss that would quietly shape the rest of her career. Her father died while she was still a student, and Emma has spoken in interviews about how disorienting that grief was, how it knocked something loose in her family that never fully settled back into place. She has said that her father's encouragement had given her the confidence to push herself as far as she did, and that losing him so early left her without the comfort of his presence just as her career was beginning in earnest. Many who have studied her body of work have pointed to that early bereavement as the root of something distinctive in her acting, an ability to suggest enormous internal pain through stillness rather than spectacle, a kind of grief held just beneath the surface of an otherwise composed face. After graduating, Emma spent several years doing the unglamorous work most actors do before any kind of breakthrough: radio plays, small television parts, stage work in London that paid little and demanded everything. The turning point came in the late 1980s, when she landed 2 very different television roles in quick succession. One was a serious wartime drama that allowed her to show range and depth. The other was an energetic series about a struggling rock band, which showcased her comic timing and emotional rawness in equal measure. The second of these earned her a major British television award and, more importantly, convinced the industry that she wasn't just a comedy performer with a famous surname behind her. She was a serious actress in her own right. That same period brought her together, both professionally and romantically, with the actor and director Kenneth Branagh. The two married in 1989, and for several years they were treated by the British press as something like theatrical royalty, a glamorous, intellectually matched couple who worked together as often as they appeared apart. It would have been easy for Emma to settle into the role of the wife, especially given how much attention Branagh's directing career was receiving at the time. She didn't. Instead, the early 1990s became the period in which she built a body of work entirely her own. In 1992, she starred as Margaret Schlegel in a much-admired adaptation of an E.M. Forster novel, playing a woman of fierce intelligence who rarely let her feelings show on the surface. It was, in many ways, the role she had been building toward her whole career, a character defined by restraint rather than melodrama, and it won her the Academy Award for Best Actress. The following year brought something even rarer: 2 Oscar nominations in the same season, one for a quietly devastating performance as a repressed housekeeper, the other for a supporting turn as a determined lawyer fighting a wrongful conviction case. Few actors of her generation could claim that kind of double recognition, and it confirmed what critics had begun to suspect, that Emma Thompson had a particular gift for playing women who carried enormous weight while showing almost none of it. By the mid-1990s, she had reached a peak that very few actors ever touch. She wrote the screenplay for, and starred in, a film adaptation of a Jane Austen novel, taking on both the title of screenwriter and leading actress for the same project. The film was a critical and commercial triumph, and when the Academy Awards came around, she made history by becoming the only person ever to win an Oscar for acting and an Oscar for screenwriting on the very same film. It remains one of the most singular achievements in the history of the awards. What the public didn't fully understand at the time was how much was unraveling behind the scenes. Her marriage to Branagh, the partnership so many people had admired, was quietly disintegrating under the pressure of constant collaboration and relentless press scrutiny. The two divorced in the mid-1990s, and it later became known that Branagh had begun a relationship with another actress while still married to Emma. For a woman who had spent years building a reputation for emotional restraint on screen, the public nature of that heartbreak was its own particular cruelty. She has spoken candidly, years later, about how deeply that period affected her, describing a kind of depression that made even basic functioning difficult. In one of her more memorable on-screen moments in the years that followed, a scene in which her character discovers her husband's betrayal and has to compose herself before walking back into a room full of people, she has acknowledged that she didn't have to imagine the emotion. She had already lived it. But even amid that collapse, something else was quietly beginning. While filming the Austen adaptation, she had worked alongside an actor named Greg Wise, who played a charming but unreliable love interest in the story. Their relationship started as nothing more than a professional friendship, but as Emma's marriage fell apart, Greg became something steadier, a calm, undramatic presence who didn't try to fix her pain but simply stayed nearby while she worked through it. What started as friendship slowly became something deeper, and by the end of the decade, the two were a couple. In December 1999, Emma and Greg welcomed a daughter, Gaia. The birth marked a genuine turning point in how Emma approached her career. At a moment when she could have continued chasing the kind of roles that had defined her 30s, she instead chose to step back. She began turning down major projects and significantly reduced her workload, prioritizing time with her daughter over the next big award or the next high-profile script. It was an unusual decision for someone at the height of her commercial value, but Emma has described motherhood as one of the most genuinely fulfilling experiences of her life. More grounding, in some ways, than any role she had ever played. She and Greg wanted a second child, and for several years they pursued that goal through fertility treatment. The process was, by her own description, exhausting both physically and emotionally, and after repeated unsuccessful cycles, the couple eventually made the difficult choice to stop trying. It was a private grief that she carried quietly for years, the ache of wanting to expand a family that fertility treatment simply wouldn't allow. What neither of them could have predicted was that the family they were hoping for would arrive in a completely different form, through a meeting that had nothing to do with biology at all. For years, Emma had served as a patron of the Refugee Council, a British charity supporting asylum seekers, and she had personally helped organize an annual Christmas party for refugees living in London. Many of them young people who had arrived in the country with no family, no money, and very little English. In December 2003, at one of these gatherings, she met a 16-year-old boy named Tingyebwa Agaba. His story, even by the standards of the people the Refugee Council served, was devastating. Tindi had grown up in a Rwandan farming family with 3 sisters. His father died of AIDS when Tindi was only 9 years old. Then came the genocide of 1994, during which his mother and his sisters were separated from him and were later presumed dead. At around 13, Tindi was abducted by an armed militia group and forced into service as a child soldier, a period of his life he has described only briefly and painfully in later interviews. He eventually managed to escape, was arrested and held for more than a year, and escaped again before making his way toward Uganda, where an aid worker connected him with a path to safety in the United Kingdom. But safety, once he arrived, didn't come immediately. Because of a bureaucratic error in his asylum paperwork, Tindi was left without government support for his first several nights in London. He slept outside near Trafalgar Square in the cold, with no friends, no real grasp of English, and no understanding of how to navigate a city that felt, in his words, completely indifferent to him. By the time he made it to that Christmas party, invited as part of the Refugee Council's outreach to young asylum seekers, he was, by every account, traumatized and profoundly alone. Emma has described their first encounter as almost entirely wordless. Tindi spoke very little English, and their early communication relied more on expression and instinct than on conversation. What she noticed, she has said, wasn't pity-inducing fragility but a kind of quiet alertness, a boy who was clearly paying close attention to everything around him even though he couldn't yet say much about it. He, in turn, had simply wanted to thank her for the warm meal the party had provided, after weeks of having had almost nothing. What happened next wasn't a single dramatic decision but a slow, deliberate accumulation of small ones. Emma and Greg invited Tindy to spend Christmas Eve with their family that year. He arrived suspicious, understandably so. A teenager who had been let down by adults and by entire systems had little reason to assume that a famous stranger's kindness was sincere. But over the following months, Emma and Greg kept showing up. They took walks with him. They worked on his English, practicing vocabulary and pronunciation in ordinary, unglamorous repetition. At a certain point, Emma arranged for him to receive lessons from a professional dialect coach, the same kind of specialist actors use to refine their own speech, simply because she wanted him to have every advantage in adjusting to his new life. Slowly, the visits became more frequent. Frequent visits became overnight stays. Overnight stays became something that looked, in every functional sense, like a home. Tindy began calling Emma and Greg Mum and Dad well before any formal paperwork caught up with the relationship that had already formed. Their daughter Gaia, just a small child at the time, welcomed him without hesitation, and a genuine sibling bond grew between them that has lasted into adulthood. The adoption itself remained informal for some time. There was no instant legal transformation, no single ceremony, but the emotional reality of the family had already settled into place well before any official recognition. Emma has been notably protective of her son's privacy over the years, declining to share many details of his story without his consent. But in the moments when she has spoken about him publicly, the affection is unmistakable. She has credited him with teaching her as much about resilience and forgiveness as she has ever taught him about navigating a new country, and she has described their relationship as one built on genuine connection rather than charity. Not a rescue mission, in her words, but two people who happen to need each other at exactly the right moment. What makes this story more than a feel-good footnote in a celebrity's biography is what Tindy did with the stability he was given. He went on to study politics and international relations at the University of Exeter, later completing a postgraduate degree in human rights law in London. He earned British citizenship and has spent much of his adult life working in fields connected directly to his own history, supporting refugees and asylum seekers, and in later years working in roles connected to public service and human rights advocacy. He has also spoken, when he chooses to, about the strange experience of realizing just how famous his new mother was. Reportedly, it was more than a year into living with the family before he saw one of her films in a college class and understood, for the first time, the scale of her career. He has built his own adult life in the years since, continuing his work in human rights and refugee advocacy while remaining closely connected to Emma, Greg, and Gaia. Those who know the family describe the bond between Emma and Tindy as enduring and deeply mutual. He refers to her as his mother, and she speaks of him with the same protectiveness and pride she shows toward her biological daughter. For Emma, the relationship has clearly been reciprocal rather than one-directional. She has said that he has been part of her own healing, that the version of herself who once described her own personality as restless and difficult has been softened, in part, by the steadiness he brought into her life. It's a striking reversal of the narrative people often assume when they hear famous actress adopts refugee teenager. Rather than positioning herself as a rescuer and him as someone rescued, Emma has consistently framed the relationship as something closer to mutual recognition. Two people who, against enormous odds, simply found each other. None of this means Emma stepped away from acting entirely. Even as she built her private family life, she continued choosing roles that challenged her. In the early 2010s, she took on the difficult, emotionally guarded author behind a beloved children's classic in a biographical drama, delivering a performance widely praised by critics even though it didn't bring her another Oscar nomination, an omission that sparked plenty of debate among film writers at the time. A few years later, she stepped into a major studio blockbuster, playing a warm-hearted character in a live-action fairy tale remake that went on to gross over $1 billion worldwide, proving she could still anchor a massive commercial production well into her late 50s. In 2018, she was made a dame by Queen Elizabeth II, a formal recognition of a career that had, by that point, spanned more than 3 decades and touched nearly every corner of British film and television. Rather than slowing down in the years that followed, she kept pushing into riskier territory, playing a glamorous antagonist in a stylish period villain origin story, and later taking on a frank, emotionally complex role in a film exploring intimacy and aging that drew attention for its honesty. At an age when many actresses find the industry offering them less, Emma kept finding ways to do more. It would be easy to tell the story as a simple feel-good narrative. Wealthy celebrity meets struggling refugee, celebrity opens her home, struggling refugee's life is transformed. But that framing flattens something more interesting and more honest about what actually happened. Emma Thompson did not approach Tindy as a project or a cause. By her own account, she wasn't looking to save anyone when she met him. She was simply present, paying attention, and open to a connection that most people in her position might never have noticed in the first place. It also wasn't quick, and it wasn't easy. There was no single dramatic adoption moment, no instant transformation. There was a slow, patient accumulation of small gestures, a walk here, a vocabulary lesson there, a Christmas Eve dinner that turned into a second one, and then a third. The relationship that resulted wasn't built on grand declarations. It was built on consistency, on Emma and Greg simply continuing to show up for a teenager who had every reason to expect that adults would eventually let him down again, and refusing to do so. There's also something worth noting in the timing. Emma met Tindy at one of the lowest points in her own life. In the aftermath of a painful divorce, in the middle of grieving the children she and Greg couldn't have through fertility treatment. It would have been understandable for her to retreat inward during that period, to protect herself rather than open her life to more uncertainty. Instead, she did the opposite. Whether that says something about her character, or about the particular kind of healing that comes from caring for someone else when you're hurting yourself, is something she has reflected on in interviews without ever offering a tidy answer.